Hello, I'm Grady King with Oklahoma Christians Church Resources and a leader in Hope Network Ministries. And welcome to this short webinar about rural ministry. I'm a product of rural ministry, and my guest today is Logan Hollinsaid. And Logan, you were raised in a rural church. Tell us a little bit about yourself, your context, and we'll have this discussion about rural ministry.
Sure. Yeah. So I grew up in Janesville, Wisconsin, at a church of about 50 people in a smaller town, about 50,000. We were one of two churches of Christ there. And that's really where I cut my teeth, getting to preach sermons and lead singing. I remember the first Wednesday after I was baptized, they had me give the Wednesday night devotional talk. And I thought it was going to be this, rousing speech, last 5 minutes, and I think it lasted a grand total of 30 seconds.
That's great.
My family moved to Greenwood, Arkansas, when I was in high school, just south of Fort Smith, where my dad still preaches at the Valley View Church of Christ of a little over 100 members. And then in college, I worked as I studied at Harding University for a Bible and preaching major. I worked in Rosebud, Arkansas, and would drive the church van from the campus out to Rosebud, one of the healthiest congregations I've ever been a part of, about 75 people. Now I find myself in Memphis, Tennessee, doing an associate ministry at the Oliver Creek Church of Christ. And I've sort of uncovered a desire to look back to my upbringing in rural churches and ministry and say there were some really special, unique things that happened there that can't happen in more urban settings like where I'm at now. And how can I lean into that? And how can I pour back into that?
Wow, I resonate with all that. And believe it or not, I have been by or through Rosebud. It doesn't take long to get by or through Rosebud. So, I was raised in Eufaula, Oklahoma, and Woodward, Oklahoma, in both relatively rural contexts, small churches. And I had some of the same wonderful experiences. Yes. And, we tend to think in terms of, well, it's a small church, it can't do much, it's not this. But I'm finding myself really drawn back to some of the simplicity and some of those. So I understand not only that we both grew up in rural churches, but we've had the opportunity to talk about it. And one of the things you've put in an email to me was that small churches are in the best position to pivot quickly and secure the future of our movement or our tribe in Churches of Christ.
Yes.
I got my reasons. Well, tell us more about that.
Sure. Yeah. Well, that may come as a surprise because I think as a movement, we feel pretty threatened, and we hear the statistics about how many churches are closing. And I think especially smaller congregations feel that. And to the contrary, or in the midst of that, I want to say actually small congregations, because of the way they are organized and because of their role in the community, are actually the key in our movement to helping us survive and flourish and share the gospel. So I have a few reasons for that, and I think it may be helpful just to define terms quickly.
Yeah,
what do we mean by rural? What do we mean by small church, so that whoever is listening can say, okay, this is talking about me or not. I just look at U.S. Census Bureau. It says rural is 50,000 people or less in a town. So let's run with that. And a small church is often defined by researchers as 200 people or less. You can look at, Carl Vader's, Carey Nieuwhof. That's a consistent definition. But there's research for American churches. The average church in America is less than 100 people. Research done by 21st century Christians. So if you are in a rural context in a small church, you're in good company. All that to say, you have some unique roles and abilities as a small church that can really help our movement.
Right.
That I think we should lean into. So the first is the small church, I think, has this great ability to produce leaders, to produce Christian leaders.
Absolutely.
So I come from a small church, and now I'm in ministry. Just anecdotally, as I looked around the room of fellow classmates at Harding University, at Harding School of Theology, most of them come from small churches. And that was something that was even said several times by professors at the institutions I went to, is these small churches are doing something.
Mm-hmm.
If you think about churches in your local area, I would bet you half, if not more, of those ministers come from small church settings. So there's something about it, and I think what it is small churches are able to empower young Christians to serve in ways that they might not be able to in larger settings. So thinking back to when I was immediately teaching on Wednesday nights, or immediately preaching Sunday evenings, larger congregations like the one I'm a part of in Memphis, we're just not set up to allow that much participation from younger members in our service and leadership. I'm thinking back to when I was at Rosebud. There's something not just to produce leaders, but also to attract people who want true community. And I've been doing young adult ministry in Memphis for the past almost 4 years. And there's something about small churches that is increasingly attractive to young adults, to people 30 and younger. And that may be surprising, but when I was doing ministry in Rosebud, I would fill a van full of college students from Searcy, and we would drive 30 minutes to Rosebud, Arkansas, of young college students who were eager to be a part of a small church experience. So there's something about also the community that small churches can create that is really attractive, especially to younger audiences that we're sorely missing in our movement. So there's a researcher who does a lot with small churches named Carl Jung, and he talks about the power of the small church to be something that's really needed right now in our culture. He says, in the broad context of national life, the small church represents an attractive alternative to a culture where community is in short supply. So that family environment, that community that small churches can offer, is exactly what our culture is thirsting for, whether they know it or not. I'll say one more thing, and then we can move on. On top of all of this, small churches not only are able to create leaders, to have this family communal environment that's attractive, but also they have a unique and special role in their community. So one writer, Alan Stanton, says, in rural communities, the local church has a special responsibility as one of the few permanent stakeholders. As in, if you're a small church in a smaller community, your baseline potential to impact your community is greater than that of even a larger church, like where I work in a larger city. So you also are just more connected with your community, and because of that, I think have more ability and more power to then influence and transform your community. And for all these reasons, small churches are really set up to impact their communities and our nation in a way that's specifically needed in our time that larger churches just don't have the sort of flexibility to do right now.
I remember, boy, I appreciate there's 2 or 3 observations we can talk about. One is the leadership development aspect is really important. I mean, I was 13 or 14, my voice was cracking, and I got up to lead singing, and I love to sing, but my voice would crack, and it was just went all over the place. But they were so encouraging; it didn't matter to them. And then they paid for me. The men of the church, we didn't have elders. The men of the church got together and sent me to a singing school. People, not just men, but the families paid for me to go to a singing school. And then I was, by age 16, pretty much the regular song leader at this small church when I was in high school. So I resonate with that.
Yeah.
And then the part-time preacher there that was also worked at a post office and raised his own family, drove 26 miles to preach that little church. He said, I want you to go out now that you can drive at age 16, work you up a little lesson on John 3:16 on the love of God. I'll give you a little outline. And there's a small, literally an American Indian church about 15 minutes away from here. I want you to go out on Sunday morning before our service and just give that lesson and sing a couple of songs and help them with communion. I was 16 years old, and I did not realize how significant that was. So I totally agree on the leadership. I want to push back a little bit in our tribe, in particular in Churches of Christ. I would say 200 is a mid-sized church now.
Yeah.
And that, when I'm thinking, I want to say pushback, I mean, I'm thinking 200, goodness, especially after COVID. We can talk about that a little bit about what it's done, COVID's done to our churches, but the leadership component, and then I would say a 200 member church, mid-size. So I'm thinking a lot of our churches are somewhere between, like in the state of Oklahoma, if you took out 15 to 20 churches over 250 to 300, the average size Church of Christ in Oklahoma is probably 75 to 80. It's a rural state outside of 8 or 10 communities of over 50,000. And so it's really challenging, but I still think it's true. So my third observation, based on what you're saying, is some small churches are pretty insular and they just focus on themselves. It's me and thee, and I worry about thee. And so now we got to shift to thinking about, what does it mean to be driven by this gospel and called by this gospel and shaped by the mission of God? Can you reiterate that or talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think of it as an inward and then to outward movement that small churches can accomplish really well if they're healthy. As inward as in they create this family environment that creates leaders and commitment and accountability. And then when a small church is working well, it's then not keeping that within, but then turning outward and pouring that into their community. We see this is how the church functions in the book of Acts, for example. They gather together, they're devoting themselves to the apostles' teaching and the taking of the Lord's Supper and communion and worship. And then the next chapter is them pouring out into the world. So this is exactly how smaller churches should function as well. And what it means is small churches need to be aware of their context, as in, do you know how many people live in your town? Do you know what their demographics are? As in, how many young people are there? What color are the people who live there? Why are they moving there? Often smaller communities are either because people are coming from nearby urban centers as a way of maybe retreat or retirement, or there's a center in the small community that employs more blue collar work. You got to know all these things about your community, because when you're functioning within God's mission, you're going to be leaning into those opportunities to connect with your community. So it is a challenge to smaller churches. I think it can be tempting, especially when we feel threatened, to turn our backs to the world. but this may sound counterintuitive, actually exactly what our movement needs in these seemingly dire times is to open up, and that will create this forward movement and this growth.
So what are you hearing about rural churches during the pandemic? Since March of 2020, all of us have been impacted, and there's lots of these anxiety triggers, disruption and constant tension and anxiety in the culture and our own people with mask and not mask. And so has that, just a brief comment about the rural church. I know some rural churches that basically recently just said, COVID did us in. We've had to close. We've liquidated our building. We've invested in 10 or 12 kingdom opportunities with the cash we received from it. So that's the ultimate, giving of blessing the kingdom, but that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about how can we survive and thrive.
Yes. Yeah. And I just want to say, as I talk with my dad, who's a minister in Greenwood, Arkansas, and other friends I have, like the impact and difficulty of COVID, especially on smaller churches, cannot be overstated. And so if, especially as a leader or a minister, if you are still recovering and maybe hurting and reeling from COVID, just know that you're not alone and you're in good company. And I think there's a way forward. So one of my visions or goals is to interconnect our smaller communities, our smaller churches.
Interconnect.
And above that, there's this sort of divide between bigger churches in cities and then smaller churches in smaller communities, and maybe even a sense of competition or animosity, maybe too strong of a word, but what if we see neither a large church or a small church as better or worse, but as uniquely and wonderfully suited to do gospel things in their context. And then as we look to our brothers and sisters at other small churches or larger churches, we can say, how can we partner together? How can we share resources and fellowship and vision? And in that way, when you might feel like your small church is just on the ropes right now, now you've got this new family and this new community that can pour into you, and vice versa. I think that's the way forward.
The proximity aspect, if you've got large churches within a reasonable driving distance, there's no reason that some of those members could go over and help bless, help teach, encourage, sing. And so you got this cross fellowship that's really helpful, and being turned toward the gospel. Well, before we kind of wrap up, can you get really practical? What are 2 or 3 things that you want us to take away from this conversation? If you had to say, here's 3 things, we're both preacher types, so we got to have 3 points and a poem and a sermon here. But what are the 3 things that you would say, if you don't remember anything else, remember these 3 things and some practical things?
Yes. Just want to reiterate, if you are a small church leader, especially you feel like you're recovering or struggling from COVID, just know you are not alone, that you are in good company, that the majority of churches in the world are what we would consider small churches, that you have to think when Jesus began this Christian gospel and began the spreading of the church, he imagined that as small churches spreading across the world. It's no mistake that small churches is how God's kingdom has functioned and will function. So you're not lesser in any way. And the other thing I want to say is, as a small church leader, you may feel pressure to adopt all these new strategies and read all these books, and surely there's something I'm not doing right. What if you've got almost all the tools you need as a small church, just because of your community, just because of your culture as a small church, and what if your role is simply to lean into those more? So what I mean is, small churches have strengths sort of built into who you are, of community involvement, of service and leadership opportunities for young people, of a sort of family environment where you're having this
Sure.
intergenerational connection.
Right. Right.
You've got a toughness and a flexibility that isn't found elsewhere. Those are the exact things that our movement needs desperately right now. So simply lean into your strengths, lean into the things that already might come naturally to you as a small church. And this is what your community needs to hear the gospel. Just keep doing it. And maybe if you're not leaning into things like allowing your young people to serve, or plugging in your community, or specifically connecting older folks in your church with younger, those are some ways you can grow and just lean more into your strengths there.
Wow. One of the things I found in my work at Oklahoma Christian and doing some surveys and having some students work at contacting churches is one of the needs that came up, especially with churches that have like one minister and they may be 75 to 100 people, and that minister's working themselves a lot. They're doing a lot of work. Is one of the things that came up is it'd be great if we could have some elders, preachers, somebody that would come in and give that person a relief once in a while, come in and teach and share. Yeah. I'm thinking, as you're talking, wouldn't it be cool to have a rural ministry blog where people could be pointed to just sharing and getting encouragement? So I'm looking forward to you developing that, Logan. Volunteering. You're voluntold, but I like it. That's awesome. Thank you for joining me today. Thank you for joining us. And I know this is going to be encouraging and helpful to others. And we look forward to hearing more from you in the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Have a good